Welcome to a very special edition of Talking Insights in celebration of International Market Research Day. I'm Gabby Kusters, your host, and today we're going to continue our series of interviews to mark the significant day in the market research industry. Today, Nikkie Lavoie, EVP of Marketing, Brand, and Innovation at Savanta, is going to guide us through this episode. She's part of our AI task force and the host of our AI Task Force Special Edition podcasts. She brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to our discussions, and in this episode, she will be interviewing two very influential figures in the market research and AI industry. The first one being Elina Halonen. She is the founder and behavioral insight strategist at SquarePeg Insight, and of course, Karen Lynch, who we all know as head of content at Greenbook. Nikki, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the SMR AI Task Force podcast, which is a series addressing AI issues within the market research and insights space, and is a series brought to you by Talking Insights, which is an entire podcast series run by SMR. I have with me today Elina Halonen, and we are going to be talking about weird data and the impact of that on insights and in specific on AI. So without further ado, if you're listening to this and you're thinking weird data, all data is a little bit weird, you might have a thing or two to learn from Elina. So maybe we could get started, Elina, with you describing for us and defining for us what is weird data.
Sure. So weird it stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and demographic. That's what the acronym stands for. And it was coined a bit over a decade ago in psychological research to refer to the characteristics of various societies that are vastly overrepresented in psychological and behavioral research. And what it means is that the reason it's a problem in psychology is that most psychology research relies on almost entirely on samples from these countries, and particularly from the US. So about 95% of psychological research is from weird countries. That percentage has improved a little bit in the last decade, but it's not radically so. And 2/3 of that is actually from the US. But the problem is that the weird samples only represent about 10% of the world's population. And so the problem is that we are implicitly assuming that the data that comes from based on these samples, the data that comes from these samples, the findings and theories based on that is applicable to the entire humankind. And that's not necessarily the case. Some of it will be, but some of it won't. And we don't really know which one is which. That work is happening, but it's very, very slow. And the problem with that is that in many ways, the weird populations are outliers compared to non-weird populations in many, many measures. And so that's a bit of a problem. And I think that problem will multiply when we're moving into the AI space, and especially market research is already weird in the sense that most of the methods that we have are have also been developed in weird countries. In fact, I would almost go as far as like all of them have been developed in weird countries, and the vast majority come from the US. So market research is already weird. So we're just layering weird on weird on weird, and AI is just here to sort of cement it. So that's a quick intro.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because there's already been a lot of conversations in this space around potential biases that can be introduced when using AI. And a lot of what I've been hearing about those biases are primarily language, so English speaking, and then perhaps racial and ethnicity-based biases as well. But that's what made me think of you, is because actually we are thinking about the biases from within a weird bubble. So would love to hear your thoughts on, what are the potential ways that weird data introduce biases into AI systems?
Yeah, so since that's probably been covered very extensively by other people, I'm not going to touch on like racial and ethnic biases and so on. That's well covered by a lot of people. There is also, I don't know exactly what you might have covered on language, but Language and cultural context and how people think they're all intertwined. So language isn't really separate from that either. But I would say that one additional aspect is, of course, that just like science is shaped by, well, it's not neutral, it's not objective, it's shaped by the people who do science because they decide what questions are relevant and how you're going to approach them and so on. The same thing is going to happen with AI, and that's in addition to all the other stuff that we might be naturally thinking about, such as the linguistic stuff and representation. And what that means is that how we see the world seems normal because it's familiar to us, and that I think is an issue that we'll see in market research, because we think the way that we see the world is normal, and the way that we ask questions, the types of things that we are interested in to ask, to analyze, and how we analyze it, that will inevitably be a sort of a meta bias, which we are not really aware of because it's very difficult for us to even think of ourselves that way. So that's kind of the first level, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that is more detailed. So I don't know which way you want to go, because I know we also don't have unlimited time. So.
No, but I think it would be good to go into a little bit of detail, just because, as you say, some of these things have been covered, but the thing that is almost, I want to say, a warning point, and things that deserve a little bit more of explanation from someone like yourself, is that what AI often does is it repeats things like errors and biases at scale. So I would love to hear a little bit more about the details on that from you, just because I think it might be helpful to hear some examples, if you can think of any, on how this might impact our work.
Sure. So there's two sides, a couple of different sides to that. One is the design of the systems. Then you have, as a part of that, you'll have the training data and those data sets and whatever might be in those. So there's a selection of the data sets, but there's also designing the systems that we're using. So if we're thinking about designing the tools themselves, maybe a lot of companies will have their own internal systems of analyzing data and so on. So there's different aspects to that. And I don't know, maybe we start from something that I think is not yet necessarily covered in what I've seen. Is something, this is not in order of what you asked, but we'll go in order of like what feels top of mind. That's also a bias. That something I've noticed when I've interacted with different LLMs, for example, is that they have certain cultural models of politeness built into the certain communication norms built in. And that is something that there's some research on this, that LLMs respond better when you phrase your question or your request in more politely, if you add more emotional appeals and so on. There's research on this, obviously. However, cultural context will shape how people communicate, and some of that will be to do with politeness norms. That some cultures are naturally more polite, and some they're not less polite, but they have different politeness norms. They might value direct communication more. There's also different interpretations of politeness, like you could have high and low context cultures in terms of communication. And so English and US is a very low context communication, and that can be a problem when you are if you're building your research tools on LLMs that are fundamentally trained on English data, and also with the mindset of what politeness norms are, and so on. So there's quite a lot of stuff in that already.
I literally did not even know that. So like I literally did not know. This is the first time I'm hearing. So if I'm nicer to the the GPT, for example, it's going to give me better response, or give me more thorough or contextual. I mean,
supposedly there is some interesting research in this. I don't, it's not my research, but so I've read. And my first question when I thought of that was like, interesting, because like, for example, I am Finnish, so that's my native language and how I originally, would have thought. And Finnish does not have the word for please. So imagine a Finnish person is interacting in Finnish with an LLM that is well, I don't know if you've seen this, but this was in the last couple of weeks or maybe, that there was new research that basically all the LLMs, they use English as a pivot language. And now I need to reread the research, but basically what it means is that whatever language you interact with the LLM with, it will always go back to English to translate it and then translate back and back and back. So the base is always English. Now, I don't have enough technical knowledge to be absolutely sure, and also I don't think the research yet exists. But if you imagine that's what is happening, even if you interact with the LLM, and if I interacted with Finnish, how is it interpreting my communication as polite if it assumes that politeness is conveyed by using terms like please? There is no word for please in Finnish. We don't use that at all. So, and the same thing is like I've lived abroad for a long time, but there will be lots and lots of people who have not and are interacting with LLMs in English. They might be Finnish people or from other cultures who don't have the equivalent of please. So how does that impact? Like, that's just one very, very sort of simple but interesting impact of using English as the base language and the kind of Anglocentrism that is built into these models.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense as well, thinking about it. And personally, I always catch myself when I'm interacting with models, it will give me an answer and I will say something like, thank you, before I ask the next question, thank you, that was great, etc. And then I'm thinking to myself, who am I thanking? What am I thanking exactly? And is this even having any impact?
Yep.
But I guess in the end, it could be having an impact in that my thank you is then going into the retraining of that model. So now other people who are not saying thank you might be getting almost quote unquote penalized in some way if they're not using the same politeness constructs.
It's possible, yes, and also this is a fairly obvious thing to say, but for context of our conversation, obviously most of the LLMs have been trained on data on the internet, and the vast majority of information on the internet is in English. So it's not necessarily even by design. It could also be an impact on the training data. Now, if you are building a market research tool based on any of the existing models, then that is just built in, like it's so far in the black box that you might not even think about it, and you may not even see, you might not even realize what impact that has. And actually, I wanted to say that there are a couple of studies done by OpenAI and also by Anthropic, who are the company behind Claude, and they have actually done research on their own tools that they basically. I need to cheat because I made notes on this. That there are studies that they've done using two different ways of measuring culture, so Hofstadter Culture Survey and World Value Survey, and they have basically demonstrated or found in their research that their models show significant cultural bias towards North America. So they've done research on their own models, and they've actually found this. So this research is fairly recent. Like everything in the space is quite new. So there's so much to kind of consider. It's almost too much to consider, if that makes sense. Like it's very my concern with market research providers or those who are designing these tools, and also those who are using, that there's so much to consider that you might dismiss it entirely because it's just like, oh, it's just too much effort to even think about it. But that's very, very risky because it can have an impact on our work in ways that we can't even imagine yet.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that sort of leads into my next question, which is there are so many issues and there are so many things. Based on your experience and expertise across all of, this very broad field of biases and how they enter into our systems, what are some of the things we could do? And I guess almost in terms of a matter of priority, sort of what's the lowest hanging fruit, that market researchers can actually address in terms of maybe trying to counteract some of the biases that enter in through AI systems via weird data?
That's a really good question, because it depends if you're the one who's designing the systems or developing the systems, or if you are the one who is using them.
Maybe you can give us 3 different answers.
Yes.
No pressure.
Yeah, well, I think the sort of most obvious answer, which is not the low-hanging fruit, is for those who are developing these systems, is to be aware of this and kind of be take that into account when you're using different training data, and kind of diversify that training data, being conscious of the types of factors that might come in. Now, obviously, that is not cheap or easy to do, and it takes a lot of effort, and it might be that the incentives are not there for them to do that if the demand side, if the users of these tools are not asking for that,
Yeah.
which is one reason why I said, when you want to come on a podcast, like, yes, please, because I want to talk about this, so that those who are using different tools and buying those tools have the awareness to actually ask, like, have you done this? Like, what data sets is your tool, trained on, and how have you validated this across different cultures, across different languages? Because these different types of biases, or I don't know if it's a bias is such a loaded word, but these differences, maybe I should call it more like homogenization of both language and the way we think, and kind of losing some of that nuance. Like, how have you made sure that your models and your training data sets capture that diversity, both culturally and linguistically? And then also, how have you validated that? And actually asking for a lot of detail on that, because only by asking the suppliers or the vendors of various tools is how you'll actually make sure that that is the case. Now, obviously, we could spend another hour talking about exactly what that could be, but we could leave it at that. I think from the user side, apart from just asking this from suppliers, I would, I guess my first thought is to try to develop some kind of cultural awareness of how might my cultural context be different from the cultural context that I am interested in. Of course, there is always a time limit and time pressure in research, so we don't often have time for that. Which kind of, all of this kind of makes me a bit skeptical of how we're going to address this in research when we haven't addressed it or AI tools, when we haven't addressed it in research methods either. So, but we'll see. But I think having more cultural awareness is kind of the crucial part, I think, for those who are buying this. I'm kind of thinking, what kind of cultural nuance could we be missing? And also, where possible, I guess, collaborate with local experts so that you can have some sort of triangulation, at least, on what you are seeing in the data and what you might want to consider. So that's my quick tips, but there's so much to think about, and I think we don't even have all of the data of what we need to look at yet. It's quite complex. So, as is anything with AI.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like we need to have a separate whole, at least hour-long session on this topic.
I think, yeah, it's quite complex, but I really think that there is I think in English now, so it's not as much of a problem for me. But I am slightly concerned in some of the, I kind of agree with some of the concerns I've seen, that because not only are the models trained on English-speaking data, by and large, they're trained on that, it also brings with it a certain way of thinking, and there's nothing wrong with that, but there are also different ways of considering different arguments, different mental models, and so on. And when only one way is the basis of what we are considering to be universal, that's a problem. It's exactly the same problem as we have in psychology, that if the vast majority of your insights and theories are based on a very small slice of humanity, that is inherently a problem, regardless of the actual details of how it impacts. That should just be a problem, because we wouldn't be happy if that 12%, the research world would be up in arms or psychology, if that 12% that most of our knowledge about human beings was not based on us. We are represented in that, are us weird people. If it was based on someone else, we would be up in arms, like, how? That is not representative. It's only like 10%, 1 in 10 people. How is that representative to me? but because it's based on us, it feels normal and natural and okay. But that's,
And we also have privilege if it was based on another population.
Absolutely.
We have the privilege to actually step up and say
Absolutely.
something about it, whereas other people don't.
Absolutely. And that privilege is now kind of expanding into everything that's to do with AI. Because if we're honest about it, majority of these models are, at least the most influential ones, the ones with the most money, are being developed not just in the US, but in a very particular place in the US, on the West Coast. And there's a very, very small group of people who are ultimately in charge of developing these models. And that's something that we shouldn't forget, that the base models, and I'm largely talking about LLMs, because I think a lot of those are used in research tools, building research tools, that they are in the hands of a very specific group of people. So this is not particularly about the exact people who are developing these models in research, but the fact that we are building on the work of a very narrow, very, very ultra narrow slice of humanity. That's something to think about when, it's something to think about when you're using it for yourself, for your personal uses, but the impact is magnified if we are building any kind of insight tools based on very limited base model culturally and linguistically, because we have to express a degree of confidence in the findings that come out of that. Now, if we don't have a human in the loop, or the human in the loop role is small, then I think that will create problems. And it's kind of like, it seems very good right now, but give it 2 years and we may see the impact of the sort of very, very implicit bias that is not obvious to anyone just yet, and it doesn't feel like worth investing in it, you know?
Yeah. Well, as is always the case whenever I have a conversation with you, I wish it could last a lot longer, because this has been really, really helpful. I don't know, I think you are part of the AI task force, or you're in the periphery of the
No,
task
I don't.
force, something like this. Well, the task force will be tapping you. That's
we can
what I
talk
know.
about that.
Yeah.
We can talk about that.
But yeah, no, I was going to say there's a lot of frameworks and guidelines popping out from different places. SMR is doing one. I know the MRS is doing another. The Insights Association has also put together a framework and set of guidelines around how to use AI. But I think this is one of the things we know. We're talking a lot about trying to mitigate bias and trying to mitigate the risk that comes from not paying attention to bias in the first place. But I think you have a lot of really valid points and deep knowledge around, where some of these biases come from and maybe even how we can overcome them. So I won't put too much pressure on you, but hopefully we'll be
Yeah.
But
If you think about it, MRS or SMR having guidelines, both organizations are once again based in a weird country, and this is the problem, that a lot of regulation, a lot of the design, everything is coming from us, and it is a privilege. And I say that as being one of the privileged group as well in some ways, even though as a Finnish speaker I have the weird I can't use the word weird now, but one of the strangest native languages that is not related, almost entirely unrelated to Indo-European languages. So sometimes that gives me a different perspective to think about it. But at the same time, on the surface and by and large, I am also representative of that. So it's really hard because it feels so natural and normal. So I'm aware of that, but it doesn't mean that it's not worth thinking about. And it's not really about us. It's about what the work we do for clients, So we need to make sure that work is representative of others too, and not just how we think, as always.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Elina, for being on this chat with me. Like I said, would always love to talk about things like this more with you and at greater depth. So hopefully we can maybe even chat again with you. In the meantime, to everybody who's listening, thanks so much for joining this AI Task Force podcast, and stay tuned for more episodes from Talking Insights by SMR. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of the AI Task Force podcast, which is a little sub-series within the podcast Talking Insights, brought to you by SMR. I am Nikkie Lavoie, EVP of Marketing, Branding, and Innovation at Savanta, and I am here with the lovely and wonderful and most amazing Karen Lynch, Head of Comms at Greenbook. Is
Head of
that right?
content, head of
Head of
content, yeah.
content, head of all things glorious at Greenbook.
Head of way more than my title suggests.
As are we all. So if you have seen or heard anything interesting from Greenbook, surely Karen has been behind it. So thank you very much for joining me today. As always, I'm super excited to have this conversation with you, excited to have any conversation with you. So let's dig in. Obviously, this podcast is focused on AI, as are so many conversations around our industry right now. But I specifically wanted to get you on so that we could hear from you about what Greenbook is seeing, hearing, thinking, and doing related to AI in our space. So for my first question to you is, how has Greenbook viewed the evolution of AI in our space over the past several months? I'm saying months because I know that AI has been around for a while, but it seems like maybe 14 months ago it came onto the scene, like not even quite 2 years. So yeah, what are some of the things that you have observed in terms of the evolution in AI?
Yeah, sure thing, Nikki. And also really, first of all, thank you for inviting me on here. It's just a pleasure to be chatting with you. I want to mimic what you just said, which is like, I just love talking to you every time. So we will stay hyper focused, but
Yes.
just know that I'm really also excited to be here. I think that I think at first, if we go back, and yes, it's been, I think we're at 15 months or something since generative AI hit the scene, which is the turning point that most people are referring to when we talk about, the increase in our adoption of AI. It's really when generative AI hit the scene with ChatGPT, everything exploded. It's not that there weren't some AI functionalities happening across our ecosystem. And there was even some partners who were starting to use some forms of artificial intelligence in their work. But generative AI was the game changer, right? So what we have seen is, and for those of you who aren't necessarily versed in what Greenbook does, we're a multimedia company. So our lens is always that, what are we taking in? And we have seen the shift from is this a friend or a foe to, oh, okay, well, it doesn't matter what we think because it's happening, because we're using it, because it's going to be the way of the world. And now we're shifting to use cases. That's one kind of shift we've seen. We've also seen the narrative changing from, last year we had a virtual AI event in September, and there were a lot of vendors, supplier partners talking about what's possible with AI. And now, like on our North America event agenda, IIEX North America, we're seeing more brands coming forward saying, here's how we're using it. So we've gone into actual use cases, case studies, and how-tos rather than just the possibilities, which I think we were talking about more in the fall. So we've definitely seen that shift. And I think we're certainly at our, in our world, we're learning how people are using it to overcome their personal pain points and, how can I do my job more efficiently or do the work of the insights professional more efficiently, but also to how can I, for instance, drive our go-to-market strategy with AI assist, or how can we influence product performance with some AI assists. So we're really starting to push into more strategic thinking with AI. And when I say we, I do also want to have the caveat out there that we are tracking some, trend reports and all that. And we are still on the very early adopter side. So we talk about it as if this is prolific, but early adopters, we're still between 5 to 10% adoption. So, and so even though we talk about this is how we're doing it, this is not how everybody is doing it. This is how those leaders are using it. So yeah. I think that's one thing that we also kind of want to just make sure we keep in the conversation.
Yeah. So one thing for me is that Greenbook for many years has been synonymous with, and really before it became this big multimedia giant, it was the directory. It was the place where you went to find a partner who does this or a company that does that. Are you seeing anything specific in the directory that you think is tied to, the increasing influence of AI in our space?
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, AI is the biggest topic by far in our ecosystem in that space. The most frequently searched category in the Greenbook directory right now is AI. And we are
Wow.
seeing that, yeah, that's sort of universal. And I think that there are there's so many things I can talk about. I don't want to jump ahead of you too much, but there was an influx of articles submitted to our ecosystem on AI, for example. We started an expert channel called The Prompt for all of our AI content to kind of be wrangled, and it is the highest performing from a search standpoint right now in our ecosystem. So we are seeing it across other aspects of the business. It's our the Insights Tech showcases. It's been featured heavily in our Insights Tech showcases. So kind of across the board in our different content pillars beyond just our events, it's
Yeah.
it's the thing, right?
Yeah. And how are you managing that? So a little curveball question for you, which is, there's probably got to be, as is always the case, AI aside, there's going to be good quality content and maybe less good quality content. But if you're seeing such an influx of content related to AI, what role do you play, or does Greenbook play, in terms of trying to ensure that what is being, disseminated is helpful? Is it truthful? Is it accurate? Or is that sort of something that you let the community weigh in on?
Well, again, with the media company lens, sometimes it's not up to us to police what's being shared. If somebody wants to share a particularly controversial point of view, we will allow that to happen. If it's almost more on the editorial side, for example, you're allowed to share those points of view. We will allow them to encourage that kind of conversation. So that's the perk of being a media company, right? Is we can have some flexibility with what we put out there because it's authored by somebody who has a point of view, and we allow that author to showcase their work. For example, when it comes to our events, we, the content team really carefully looks at session titles, and we try very hard to encourage people, if they are submitting something that somebody else is talking about, we might say, that's being covered in another session. You might want to find a new angle. So we try to work with our speakers so that it is comprehensive across all of our sessions. For example, when it comes to written content or videos being shared in our ecosystem or infographics, I personally review all of those submissions and work with sponsors as well when they submit to make sure that it checks out. We're not going to do anything that doesn't check out for us with our quality standards. So that's kind of in my role across the board, where we do our best with the understanding of who we are in the industry and what our role is.
Yeah. So what are some of you've talked about all of the different content and topics, and everyone sort of wants to talk about it. What does Greenbook see? What's your sort of point of view in terms of the challenges around adopting AI in our space? Because the thing that's great about this session is that Greenview, everyone exists in little bubbles. We all have our little echo chambers, but Greenbook is seeing all of it. So it's really great to just sort of hear from you. So what do you foresee as some of the challenges for adopting?
Yeah, and also just kind of with that in mind, we also have our GRIT report. For those of you who don't know GRIT, it's the Greenbook Research Industry Trends Report, and we are working on the current wave, which was fall data, and so we also have some gleanings as to what's happened with AI in there. So, for example, report writing, right? The challenge of report writing. There are people that are leaning more heavily into using generative AI for report writing, for example. Tech providers or data and analytic providers, people that are really comfortable in that space, have no problem asking for the assist that generative AI can do with report writing. But then there are others that are like, oh no, not doing that yet. It needs just the human touch. So there's a big disparity there. And I think that one of the challenges for individuals is finding their comfort level with how are we using AI to assist us in our report writing versus writing it for us. And I think that there's challenges that still exist with depending on what platform people are using or how they're using it, do we trust the integrity of the generative AI content? So I think that's one challenge we saw, and it was, echoed in Grit as well. I think that there is still cynicism around synthetic samples. So another kind of talking point that came out of Grit, if you will, or data point that came out of Grit, is that people are fascinated with synthetic sample, as generative AI can help with that. We've seen some of that this past year, and people are really interested by it, but super cynical. And so I think trust and credibility is a challenge.
Yeah.
There's also, I would say, we know firsthand procurement issues on the end client brand side, that a lot of suppliers would like to be doing more AI work. A lot of insights professionals would like to be doing more AI work, but procurement are sometimes gatekeepers, right? We were invited in to a very large global pharmaceutical companies conference for procurement to present on kind of the state of AI from our lens. And we went in with our sister company, Gen2 advisors, to talk to procurement specifically, to say, hey, here's the playing field so that procurement doesn't become an issue. So I think those are probably the biggest ones.
Yeah.
Trust, credibility, procurement, and then just overall risk adversity or apprehension there.
That's the big one. I think risk is always interesting because, at least in my experience, there are a lot of clients who want to experiment with AI and want to see what the benefits of it could possibly be. But as we know, a lot of clients are very risk averse. So they want to sort of pass that risk down to the agency side folks. But then the agency side folks have the procurement battle or the trust and credibility battle. So I feel like there's this tension right now. So another interesting thing from my perspective is Greenbook does host the Insights Innovation Exchange, which is a series of events that you guys do globally with a couple of different subtopics as well, which is great. And so thinking about those events, and not just the events themselves, but obviously there's other forums, Greenbook inherently plays a role in, the adoption of AI or the innovation of AI specifically in our space, because you're providing a format for people to exchange. So, what do you see as, the most important elements of that role, and is it important? Is it not? And how shall you continue moving forward?
Yeah. I mean, I think, one of the, if you think about the role of Greenbook, as I've mentioned in the media space, part of what our roots with the directory, as you mentioned, has always been kind of, let's connect buyers with sellers. Let's make it easy for them to find each other. So that's, that's one thing, and that will keep going, right? We're just doing that with a new set of product features for many of the suppliers, and we're helping buyers find suppliers that have AI functionality and features in their product offerings. But we also help through our content. We use the phrase separate the signal from the noise. We help professionals figure out what they need to know and what's important, critical for them to do their jobs better, make their companies more successful, whatever that might be. Stay informed about key developments, and ultimately make sound decisions based on what they're learning for themselves or for their businesses. So I think, we're going to keep doing that. As a company, we're not necessarily in the business of telling people you should do that or you shouldn't do this. But if you ever listen to Lenny and I on our weekly live stream, the exchange, we're pretty clear that personally, Lenny and I are like, we think that maybe you should be adopting this technology, whether it's within your business or within your vendors, because personally, we are watching those trends and we are curating content all the time. And, we even talked about, on last Friday's episode, for example, we talked about, which I don't know the timeliness of this launch, but on one of our episodes in March, we talked about a consumer trends report that is by a venture capital firm. And it was saying, even though we are where we are with adoption, we know where we're headed. Generative AI is really the way of the future. So we can't hear a statement like that and not make strong suggestions personally. But overall, Greenbook's role is to just keep helping individuals learn, navigate the space, make decisions for themselves or their companies. And we do the best we can to kind of curate information that can help them with those things.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, as a last question for you, and this is always the hardest question. I simultaneously love and hate this question. It's from a researcher perspective, it's always like, would you buy this product in the future? Well, we all know you shouldn't really be asking people to do that. But at the same time, I'm going to go ahead and ask, what do you think the future holds? What's Greenbook's prediction of AI, the relationship between AI and market research and insights?
I will talk personally because I don't know if I can speak for the entirety of Greenbook. Sort of like what I was just implying, Lenny and I firmly believe that vendors in particular need to have AI offerings in their products. Vendors in that space, they need to help clients overcome their challenges with using those methods and getting buy-in from their corporate gatekeepers. So I think that it will just get more and more pronounced. We are not going to turn the dial back on this one. It is just going to keep moving forward. So again, the future holds more and more adoption. If we're at 5 to 10% adoption, as humanity is at 5 to 10% adoption, that will only go up. Let's hope that we are all ready for when it becomes, the majority have adopted, and then the late majority have adopted. So I think that if we understand what adoption is like, there was a time when not everybody had a mobile phone, and now we can't leave. We can't leave a room without taking it with us. So if we recognize the way these types of trends go, we have to recognize that it is going to be a dominant force in our futures. And let's just keep that fact in mind. That is not speculation.
Well, fantastic. We are at time. So thank you so much, Karen, for joining me and for telling me all about sort of Greenbook's role in all of this sort of maelstrom of information that's coming from the AI side and predictions around where we'll be. So appreciate it. And for those of you who are listening, stay tuned for the next episode of the AI Task Force podcast as a part of the Talking Insights series from SMR. And see you next time.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for that, Nikki. Now, International Market Research Day is officially today, but we still have one more day of celebration, which is tomorrow. And tomorrow we're going to be covering sustainability. So stay tuned because there's so much more that SMR has to offer.